McCann is an award-winning author of 7 novels, collections of short stories. He's a world traveler, and as you're going to find out very, very soon, a wonderful storyteller. And he has both some wonderful things to talk to us about, but he's also really interested in hearing questions. So let's make sure that we're thinking about those questions as we get started. Cool?
Do you hear that music, Jason?
What's that?
Do you hear that music?
Yep, I'll take care of it. That's just fun. Let's turn that little bit of a clapping right into a welcome to our friend, Mr. Colum McCann.
Hi guys. Is it on? I don't know if it's on. Not yet. Hi guys.
Yeah. Hi, there we go.
Alright, that's for the singing that goes on later on. Are you all ready for a sing song?
Yeah. Yes.
We might actually do. I don't know. It might be really serious here tonight. Can I take this off? It's alright? Thank you. Pleasure to be here. What a school. What a nice day I had. Some of the best questions I've had at a school environment, be it third level, secondary level, in many, many years. Incredible hospitality. It's really nice to be here, and I hope to open up with you this evening and give you a chance to ask whatever sort of questions you want to ask about the writing life, about books, and whatever else it happens to be. But I prepared a few things that I wanted to talk to you just a little bit for about 20 minutes or so about stories and storytelling and resilience and storytelling in this age that we're living in now, the exponential age. Thank you to everybody for inviting me, and I want to talk to you a little bit about Einstein and Freud. So in the early 1930s, a series of letters went back and forth between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud. That Einstein and that Freud. And Einstein, as you know, was the father of...
Relativity.
Thank you. Good. Father of relativity, pacifist, quirky scientist who was interested in the theory of everything. Yes. Freud was a neurologist, explorer of the mind and the body, the father of psychology, psychoanalysis. And really they were the bellwether minds of their times. So in the summer of 1932, almost 100 years ago, Einstein, in the course of exploring man's lust for hatred, these days he would say humankind's lust for hatred, he asked Freud if Freud thought it might be possible to, quote, guide the psychological development of man so that it can become resistant to the psychoses of hate and destruction, thereby delivering civilization from the menace of war. Not your ordinary Viennese cafe conversation. The psychoses of hate, delivering civilization from the menace of war. The world, as you know, 1932, was on the knife edge of destruction and had already witnessed, through the First World War, the opening ding-dongs of doom. And Einstein and Freud, as the bellwether minds of their times, felt a moral and public responsibility to speak out. So Einstein wanted to cultivate the idea of a world peace, and he believed that Freud might help him find an answer. So he wrote to him. And in the eventual official reply, which came by post several weeks after the initial request, Freud said to Einstein that all his life he'd been telling people truths that were difficult to swallow. In his opinion, there was not much likelihood at all of our being able to suppress humanity's aggressive tendencies. It is easy to infect mankind with war fever, he said, and people have an active instinct for hatred and destruction. Not very optimistic so far. But what he did say is that the desire to end war was not impossible. Anything, and I quote, anything that creates emotional ties between human beings must inevitably counteract war. And what should be sought is a, quote, community of feeling and a mythology of the instincts. So, I'm involved in an organization called Narrative 4. We want to bring it to your school. We will bring it to your school over the next couple of years. Narrative 4 brings young people together from disparate backgrounds, and they step into one another's shoes. It's the most thrilling thing that I'm involved in, even when I think about the world of books, and it's where I've seen change happen on the ground. So over the past 6 years, students at a school in the South Bronx, the University Heights High School, they've been conducting an experiment in empathy in which they employ storytelling as a means of engagement. So it's an organization I co-founded with a social entrepreneur by the name of Lisa Consiglio. The school, in one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States, is run by a visionary principal, Hazel Joseph Roseborough. And the program is relatively simple. You step into my shoes, and I will step into yours, and then I will tell your story back in the first person. This Narrative 4 program brought together the Bronx students with pupils from the Floyd County High School in rural, does anyone know? Thank you. Do we have some Kentucky people here? Yeah, where did Kentucky come from? All right. And I've just been down in Kentucky. Oh my gosh, and I love the place. This is rural Appalachian, and an extraordinary place with extraordinary people. But you know, on the one hand, you have mostly black kids meeting with mostly white kids, urban meeting rural, blue meeting red, all of this stuff. Now, some of the young people, when they were talked about meeting with one another, were nervous to the point of being ill at first. But then they began telling stories to one another, and then telling their stories back to their partners. And when they did so, guys, their fear faded, their imaginations expanded, and they began to see the world in an altogether different way. For example, there's a young girl, Fatima. She wears the hijab. She lives in the South Bronx. She meets with a guy called Tim, who drives a pickup truck with a rifle in the back, and the faded imprint of a Confederate flag on the back of his pickup truck. Do you think they can understand and know one another? Well, it's very difficult until they actually meld and start to tell personal stories to one another. And then Tim realizes that Fatma, underneath her hijab, is actually listening to music on her AirPods, that the same music that he might also be listening to. And she realizes that one of the reasons he has a pickup truck like this is that he inherited it from his father. He took off the flag from the back, it still left an imprint in the back, and the reason he has a shotgun is because he's so poor that he shoots rabbits for dinner. And she thinks, ooh, I never even thought about that. I never even thought about these young people having to do these sort of things. And they begin to grow closer to one another, and they begin to understand one another. And this fear, and these barriers, and these things that have been put down in front of them begin to dissolve. Not because they're talking about ideas, but because they're talking about personal stories. Because they're talking about something that is intimate to them. They're talking about something so detailed, so true, that nobody can deny it. It doesn't become a fact-based thing. It doesn't become something where you can say it's untrue. It doesn't become something you could distort. It's very difficult to distort these ideas that are in the human heart of love and pride and pity and sacrifice and compassion. History and dates and social constructs can be distorted. But these other things, which are like when I'm talking to you on an emotional level, is very hard to distort them. And they came together. And those kids from the Bronx got an idea of what it meant to be like from a coal mining family in the South, down in the holler, as they say, down in Kentucky. And the students from Kentucky could understand the Northerners' fears of stepping into a grocery store where the Confederate flag hung over a cash register, and they talked together about the opioid crisis, the US suicide epidemic, and they also talked and discovered what it means when we talk about love and engagement and civic responsibility. They weren't discussing facts and figures, but sharing the deep texture of their lives. The story of their fathers, their mothers, their grandfathers, sisters, brothers, and teachers. Let me tell you, I just got a call this week from a young kid called Dakota. Dakota got COVID. He brought it home. His father died. He dug his father's own grave last week in rural Kentucky. While he was digging his father's grave, he collapsed and his own lung and was taken back into hospital. This sort of stuff is going on, and all the Bronx kids got in touch with him, and they're sending each other money now, and looking after one another. These kids who would have been a million miles from one another at any other time in our history. The exchange highlighted what I think stories can do. The world gets complicated, and we talked a little bit about this in class today. The world gets muddy, and the world gets nuanced. It's hard to find beginnings, and it's hard to find endings, and that's okay. And then the students were tasked with turning that newfound empathy into action, embarking on projects involving the opioid epidemic and issues of mental health. And we've always believed at Narrative 4 that the story itself is probably never enough, and that sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. But when stories lead to action and change on the ground, that's when things start to flare up and get better for us all. One last thing in relation to this, and then I'll go into a little reading. I want to talk to you about the principle of emergence, because it relates to what I'm talking about in the Bronx and in Kentucky, but it in particular relates to all you young people out there, and you can understand it. The principle of emergence states that that a multitude of any number of living things, neurons, bacteria, ants, computer pieces, can exhibit properties way beyond the capability of any one individual. Flocking birds can display emerging qualities, for instance, wheeling across the sky in seamless formations. Honeybees become so much more startling when they work in unison, and groups of people possess intelligence, or indeed sometimes stupidity and violence, far greater than the sum of our parts. I think that storytelling too can exhibit the possibility of emergence, and in this, possibly the most fractious time that we have had in many, many, many centuries, sharing our stories might be one of the things that might possibly save us. What happens when we actually set out to understand the stories of others, not just of those across the street, but also from people from vastly different backgrounds? What happens if the simple act of listening and talking becomes the thing that bolsters our very notions of peace, equality, democracy, and understanding? What we need to do is harness our ability to listen to and engage with the stories of those we don't necessarily know or even like. Because you don't have to love someone, you don't even have to like someone, but you do have to understand them. It begins in our own backyards, and then it spreads itself outwards. Often we come up against the notion, especially from the marginalized, that our own narratives don't matter. But inside the principle of emergence, everything matters. That's what happened those days in Bronx and Kentucky. They stepped beyond themselves. Their great triumph was that they got to know both worlds at once. We didn't demand that they win an argument. We didn't ask for them to be didactic. We didn't want them to change anyone's mind. They all did all this work themselves. And this was the sort of change that rose from the ground up like a flocking bird. It was crowdsourced, it was random, it was self-correcting. And it came from personal stories, not politics. These young people made their empathy into action projects on the ground, not least in engagement with local veterans in a hospital in the Bronx and their opioid groups down in Kentucky. And phone calls went amongst them, and they were permanently changed. Stories are amongst our acts of resilience. To say that I've existed and I still exist. Death can take away a lot of things, but it will not take away our ability to tell our stories. All of this says that you, and in particular your generation, who can build on Emergence more than any other generation has done before because of the access to technology that you have. All of this means that you guys matter. And I'm really going to be excited to see over the next 20 years, if I'm still hanging around, or 25 years, or whatever else it happens to be, what people will do with this power that you have at your fingertips. Because storytelling can break through isolation, it can bind us together, it's democratic, it crosses divides. We are not as stupid as our political parties seem to need us to be. We're not available for simple sound bites. We need to re-nuance where we're coming from. We need to go to the farthest point we thought we could go, and then take another 5 steps eastward, westward, redward, blueward. I don't care. You want to save this country, this democracy, this global venture of ours. We need to learn how to listen to and retell the stories so that they become ours. Walt Whitman said, "We are large, we contain multitudes. We cannot deny those multitudes because in the right hands they work miracles." Thank you. Now, I don't think I'm a miracle worker, but I do think that in the presence of people who have the capability of performing miracles, both students and teachers alike. I want to thank Quint and Jason and Douglas and everybody here and all the teachers here and the whole administration for giving me a chance. Look, I've been traveling a little bit again, and some of the stuff that's going on at airports is really interesting because they'll come out over the tannoy and say, if you were military or an active military duty, please show your military card and you get on the plane first. And that's cool. That's great. I'm happy with that. I agree with that. These people are putting their lives on the line. They're also now saying, which is even better, first responders. If you're a first responder, get on the plane. I can't wait till the day when you show your union card or your teacher's card or wherever it happens to be, and then we get on the plane first. Because I do think that this is the cold face of our democracy, and that these things are very, very, very important. And so it strikes me as that I'm the privileged one, I'm the lucky one, and I had the great privilege of having one of my books taught here for the past number of years, called Let the Great World Spin. I'm going to read to you a couple of sections from this tonight, and then I'm going to open the floodgates to questions. And honestly, we have a lot of time, and any question is fair, except why my football team is doing so badly right now. Let the Great World Spin. It takes place in New York in 1974, on the day that Philippe Petit does his tightrope walk across the World Trade Center towers. He actually went back and forth, I think, 9 times. It was a quarter of a mile in the sky. The rope, the tightrope, the wire was an inch and a quarter. Was it 3/4 of an inch thick or an inch and a quarter thick? But see, I bet the students know more about this book than I do now because I wrote it 10 years ago. So I take characters from the city, and I try to engage with that moment of creation, which stands in almost perfect opposition to the moment of destruction that came 27 years later. And I'm just going to read a few short sections, hop around in the book a little bit, and then open it up to you guys. So, way above there was a movement. In his dark clothing, as every twitch counted, he folded over, a half thing bent, as if examining his shoes like a pencil mark, most of which had been erased. The posture of a diver. And then they saw it. The watchers stood silent. Even those who had wanted the man to jump felt the air knocked out. They drew back and they moaned. A body was sailing out into the middle of the air. It was gone. He'd done it. Some blessed themselves, closed their eyes, waited for the thump. The body twirled, caught and flipped, thrown around by the wind, and then a shout sounded across the watchers. A woman's voice, "God, oh God, it's a shirt. It's just a shirt." It was falling, yes, a sweatshirt fluttering, and then their eyes left the clothing in midair because high above, the man had unfolded upward from his crouch. And a new hush settled over the cops above and the watchers below, a rush of emotion rippling amongst them, because the man had arisen from the bed, holding a long, thin bar in his hands, jiggling it, testing its weight, bobbing it up and down in the air, a long black bar so pliable that the ends swayed, and his gaze was fixed on the far tower, still wrapped in scaffolding like a wounded thing waiting to be reached. And now the cable at his feet made sense to everyone. And whatever else it was, there would be no chance they could pull away. No morning coffee, no conference room cigarette, no nonchalant carpet shuffle. The waiting had been made magical, and they watched as he lifted one dark slippered foot like a man about to enter a warm neighborhood. The watchers below pulled in their breath all at once. The air felt suddenly shared. The man above was a word they seemed to know, though they had not heard it before. Out he went. Next section is in an Irish voice. Corrigan once told me that Christ was quite easy to understand. He went where he was supposed to go. He stayed where he was needed. He took little or nothing along, a pair of sandals, a bit of a shirt, a few odds and ends to stave off the loneliness. He never rejected the world. If he had rejected it, he would have been rejecting mystery. And if he rejected mystery, he would have been rejecting faith. What Corrigan wanted was a fully believable God, one you could find in the grime of the everyday. The comfort he got from the hard, cold truth, the filth, the war, the poverty, was that life could be capable of small beauties. He wasn't interested in the glorious tales of the afterlife or the notions of a honey-soaked heaven. To him, that was a dressing room for hell. Rather, he consoled himself with the fact that in the real world, when he looked closely into the darkness, he might find the presence of a light, damaged and bruised, but a little light all the same. He wanted, quite simply, for the world to be a better place, and he was in the habit of hoping for it. Out of that came some sort of triumph that went beyond theological proof, a cause for optimism against all the evidence. Someday, he said, the meek might actually want it. I debated whether or not I'd do this naughty piece or not. And then Douglas told me one of his favourite lines from the novel, and then I thought, that's even naughtier, so I can read this. We're all grown-ups here. I'm really worried about this. Alright, it's alright. Okay, one of my favourite characters in the book is a woman, well, I shouldn't say my favourite character, but one of the characters that I'm proud that I somehow had a chance to spend time with is Tilly, who is a 38-year-old prostitute in the South Bronx. And she's kind of raunchy, and hopefully she's funny. This is just a half page where she says, and I can't do the Bronx accent, I'm very sorry. I got another trick I thought I recognized. Oh yeah, this is the reason I read this is because my wife thinks it's very funny because she says it sounds like it's semi-autobiographical. Because you'll know from the second line. I got another trick I thought I recognized. He was youngish, but bald on top. He was middle-aged, but bald on top. No, he was young, but bald on top. The bald spot was very white, like a little ice rink on the top of his head. He got a room in the Waldorf Astoria. The first thing he did was he pulled the curtain tight and fell on the bed. And he said, "Let's get it on." I was like, "Wow, do I know you, honey?" He looked at me hard and said, "No." "Are you sure?" I said, "Oh, cutesy and shit. You look familiar." "No." He said, real angry, "Hey, take a chill pill, honey, I'm only asking." So I pulled off his belt and unzipped him and he moaned, "Oh yeah, like they all do." And he closed his eyes and he kept on moaning, and then I don't know why, but I figured it out. It was the guy from the weather report on CBS. Except he wasn't wearing his toupee. That was his disguise. So I finished him off and got myself dressed and waved goodbye, but I turned at the door and said to him, "Hey man, it's cloudy in the east with the wind at 10 knots and the chances are last piece, and we restore some dignity to the process. is a photo on page 237, and this little piece that I'm going to read relates to the photograph. It's a photograph that actually was taken in New York in 1974, and it's a plane. Here's the building, and here's the tightrope walker. This is not photoshopped in any manner or means, and it looks as if the plane is about to go into the building. And this is the little section towards the end of the novel. Thank you for listening. Roaring Seaward, and I Go, October 2006. She often wonders what it is that holds that man so high in the air. What sort of ontological glue? Up there in his haunted silhouette, a dark thing against the sky, a small stick figure in the vast expanse. The plane on the horizon, the tiny thread of rope between the edges of the buildings, the bar in his hands, the great spread of space. The photo was taken on the same day her mother died. It was one of the reasons she was attracted to it in the first place, the sheer fact that such beauty had occurred at the same time. She had found it yellowing and torn in a garage sale in San Francisco 4 years ago at the bottom of a box of photographs. The world delivers its surprises. She bought it, got it framed, kept it with her as she went from hotel to hotel. A man high in the air while a plane disappears, it seems, into the edge of the building, one small scrap of history meeting a larger one, as if the walking man were somehow anticipating what would come later. The intrusion of time and history, the collision point of stories. We wait for the explosion, but it never occurs. The plane passes, the tightrope walker gets to the end of the wire, things don't fall apart. And it strikes her as an enduring moment now, the man alone against scale, still capable of myth in the face of all other evidence. Thank you. Track of time, but I'm here all night if you just want to go. But somebody will keep track of time.
I got you. Don't worry about it.
You'll lasso me.
Take care of it.
Yeah, got the shepherd hook. But I'm going to throw down the challenge because I had such great questions in class today. So who's brave enough to open up the sparring?
Okay, so I have a question about how you portray drugs in the book. Why is there little to no explanation of withdrawal symptoms from both, if not all, of the drug users in the book that suddenly stop using substance?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm sorry that there's not. But I would say that in Tilly's case, so Tilly gets she's not using drugs. It's Jasmine who's using drugs. So when Tilly goes to prison, she doesn't go into to any withdrawal. Jasmine, who is using drugs, she gets killed that very day. And in terms of serious drug abuse in the book, I don't know if there's a character. Can you explain which character might have been the one to be using and go into withdrawal?
Laura.
Oh, when she's taking Lara, when she's taking stuff earlier on. I can't even remember what she's taken. See, you would know this better. Look, I think this is sometimes when readers come in and they make your novel more intelligent for you. I bet that I could go back in and make an argument against this, but right now I don't have any argument against it at all. I do think that it is the job and the responsibility of the writer to do exactly what you're saying. In fact, I'm thinking of a character right now who's in a different situation that I'm writing right now, who I've been consulting the doctors about specifically alcohol withdrawal. But it is your responsibility as a writer to do it, and it's your responsibility as a reader to pick these things up. But I would have to go back into the book and really excavate it to see what it was that she was using. She was cocaine, but not when she's narrating the actual. Yeah. Then we lose her for a long time, right? Yeah. I'll have to good thing for me to think about.
Hi, Mr. McCann. My name is Ben. I'm a senior at Blair. First, thank you so much for coming to talk to us all tonight. It's a great book, and I'm really glad that you're here to talk to us. The first thing, so I love your message about like empathy and understanding. Like, that's great, but when you take it to action, that's when it really means something. I totally agree, and I'm really, it's remarkable that you actually did that yourself with Narrative 4. So I was just curious, how did Narrative 4 come to be? And like, what was that story?
Thank you. Narrative 4 was born in Colorado about 12 years ago when this woman, this activist who you guys would love, a woman called Lisa Consiglio, brought together all these writers, Terry Tempest Williams, Asaf Gavron, Ishmael Bea, myself, many others, and said, well, you writers have all this empathy and all this power, and you know, what happens if we start to work with young people together? And then she built this organization more or less on her own from scratch. I happen to be one of the co-founders with her. And now we're in 12 countries across the world. We're really sort of burgeoning you know, in the United States, Colombia, Mexico, and you know, there's some really radically provocative things happening. For example, you know, well, the Kentucky Bronx thing is really cool. But in South Africa, for instance, these young people are telling stories. They're identifying problems on the ground. And in a place called the Joe Slovo Township, they started this Trash to Treasure program themselves. It's all the young people. It's not anybody forcing ideas down upon them. It's all sort of coming up from underneath this whole principle of emergence. So yeah, hopefully you guys will be part and parcel of this as it goes along, because there's a lot of good stories to tell, and you know, you guys, frankly, you're in a place of privilege, and you can understand and reach out and really change things that are going on the ground.
That'd be awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for your question.
I think that, like, I loved all of the characters in Let the Great World Spin, and I think that there were so many, like, random details that really made them seem so much more well-rounded. Like, you know, like the women with the prostitutes not being able to put their hair down because they get pulled in through car windows, or like the femme bush lesbians in the prisons. And I was just wondering, like, as a man from Ireland, like, how do you come up with all this stuff? You know, how do you create such well-rounded characters from so many various backgrounds?
Thank you. You know, this is a really important question, and you know, and it plays into a lot of where we happen to be right now, and you know, like who has the right to tell these stories and so on. And you know, I will say this, that you know, the people who are talking about cultural appropriation, say for example, you know, my blessings upon them, because they're entirely right. So for a long time, for decades, centuries, you know, people have been going in, patronizing, stereotyping, condescending, lifting from cultures and so on. And I really welcome that sort of thing as an academic debate. It's not part of your question, but I want to broaden the question before I specifically answer what you're saying. At the same time, there's a way to go in, I think, with your head bowed, and as humble as possible, saying, you know, I don't know, I need to know. Can you teach me something? Can you teach me something about your culture? Can I increase my own cultural engagement by learning more about, you know, someone else or somewhere else? I've spent most of my writing life, you know, outside of Ireland, outside of this sort of, you know, this particular, you know, body. And being very interested in the stories of others, whether it be Romani or dancers, or you know, in the case of Let the Great World Spin, several other characters. And a lot of it is about deep research, but also what you have to do. So, for example, with this, I talked with a lot of, with Tilly, I talked with a lot of sex workers. I talked with cops who'd been in the Bronx. I talked with people who'd lived in the 1970s. I was telling class earlier today, I was not hanging out in the South Bronx in 1974. I was 9 years old, you know, in on my holidays in this in Varna. I watched films and I read socio-economic documents, and then I sent the stuff to people. And so I sent it to writers who I admire, writers of colour, people who were involved, and had them look and critique, everything, and I listened to as much as possible. So that's part of it. I mean, most of it is about like deep research and being interested in others. Part of this comes, I think, from me, because when I first came to this country, I took a bicycle across the country for a year and a half, and I listened to others, and I got the privilege of listening to others. And the real privilege comes when the devil is in the details. And when you get the details right, like that detail that you mentioned about the women didn't wear their hair down because they were afraid when they leaned in the window that they'd get grabbed. That just came from so either a police file that I read or from an interview that I did with somebody, and I sort of collated it all together. You try to make it as authentic as possible, but you've really got to be authentic to the human spirit as well as the details too. So that answer, but thank you, because it brings up really important questions.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My question is, what inspired you, or what in your life influenced you to create the character of Colum? Because he's always been my favorite character.
Thank you. There's this really cool monk who I met, an Italian guy who was living in Brooklyn, and then was also living down in the East Village, and he was with the Petit Frère de Dieu, or the Piccolo Frati, and he was a friend of my wife's family, and I just met this man and I thought, this guy is incredible. I've never seen anybody quite like him, and he inspired me to write about him. He basically drove a school bus during the day, and then he prayed at night, and he gave away his money, and he was actually the son of an Italian Supreme Court justice, which is probably even a better story than the one I have for Corrigan, but I want to make Corrigan Irish. He was also, he's now back in Italy, but he also spent a lot of time down in Mexico in the last 10 years, in the areas where a lot of drug dealers were. There are these amazing people out in the world, and sometimes it shocks me how much good stuff is going on, and how many of the stories don't actually get told. So at the time, quite honestly, the Catholic Church was getting a battering, and rightly so, for the things that were going on. But I knew that there were plenty of people within the confines of the Catholic Church who weren't, necessarily involved in some of the things that were going on. So I wanted to write a character like that, and create some nuance, and open up the debate a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. So I have a question about Compton and his group of hackers. So when you were first drafting the book, what was your envisionment of what their purpose in the story would be?
Could you say the first part of the story again?
So when you were drafting your book, what was your idea and purpose for the characters Compton and his group of hackers in California?
Oh, right. So these were the hackers, right?
Yeah.
So I have a chapter in the book about hackers, phone freakers, and phone hackers. I found them, sort of accidentally. And basically, I wanted them to be the precursors to the whole internet age. I mean, these men and women were breaking into phone systems the same way that hackers nowadays are breaking into computer systems. So I wanted that to be a symbol of the internet age. I also just thought it was kind of very cool that people were on these party lines, and I could do something fictionally with it that sort of hadn't been done before. So they were called phone freakers, It's funny because it's all coming back to me now, right? I saw some other hands over here, and then here. Thank you.
I was just wondering how the events of September 11th and how the title block, how that kind of drove your inspiration for the novel, and whether that was something that you started with or if it was with characters.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. I told a little bit of the story today in class. September 11th, I'm home, get a phone call from my sister in London, and she said, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" I turn on the television. It's the tower's coming down. I was in New York on 71st Street. The first building to be hit was the building where my father-in-law worked, my wife's father, right? And we watched the building on fire, and then I watched her crumble on the ground and turn and shield my son, my 1-year-old son at that stage, from seeing this when the second building came down. He got out. We didn't know it at that stage. He came up to our apartment, and he was still covered, because he walked out into that glaucoma storm of debris, covered in dust, and dust on his suit and on his shoes. And my little daughter, 4-year-old daughter, Isabella, she was 3 years old, ran down the corridor, jumped into his arms, and then she recoiled and went away from him. And said, and I found her in a cupboard. She was hiding. And I said, "What's wrong, love?" And she said, "Poppy's burning." I said, No. Poppy's not burning. There was a fire downtown. It was terrible, but you don't explain these things to children. She said, "No, you don't understand that. Poppy's burning from the inside out." And I'm thinking, "Oh, out of the mouth of babes." And that was something I would never forget. Later that day, I remember thinking, Philippe Petit did a tightrope walk. I read a book by Paul Auster about Philippe Petit and the tightrope walk, and how he had done this incredible tightrope walk, in 1974. And I thought, someday I have to write about all of this together. So it was a very personal reaction to 9/11, and very consciously a 9/11 novel from the very beginning, even though I knew that I didn't want to have any of that dust falling on any of the pages. It was very much something that I wanted to write about. It's very beautiful.
I feel like as a reader reading some of your other novels, I feel like the theme of trauma comes up a lot. How do you think that? Do you think that is a prominent theme in a lot of people's discussion, especially if something from 13 ways of looking?
I love the fact that all these young people have read all the books. And did everyone hear the question about the theme of trauma comes up again and again in my books? It does, and I can't tell you. Well, I had a relatively safe suburban upbringing. My dad came home, my mum was at home, and I got looked after. My dad passed away at the age of 86. My mum is still around at 94. I haven't experienced any huge traumas. I've had a couple of things happen in the past couple of years, but this engagement with trauma, is definitely a part of my work, and I wish I knew where it came from. I'm particularly interested in parents who have lost children. I've never hoped to have the terrible trauma of losing a child, but I wish I knew. But then again, if I knew, I mightn't write about it anymore. You know what I mean? So, part of me wants to dive deep, but I also want to find the grace behind all of that, because I've met a whole lot of people who've been incredibly graceful, including Rami and Bassam, who I wrote about in my most recent novel, A Paragon, one Israeli and one Palestinian, who wrote to me on a napkin one day, the first day I met them, use the force of your grief to turn it into grace and a power, and that was a big deal for me. Where I said this here.
What drew you to the South Bronx, especially during the time that you focused on, during when literally the Bronx was burning and there was rampant drug use, and how did you find beauty and humanity on an issue in an area that is usually really only the ugliness of crime?
Well, thank you for that, and that's one of the reasons why that sort of interested me. Well, first of all, the drug use took place in '74. And everyone knows that was the summer when the Bronx was actually burning. And I know from being, from having spent some of my time up in Northern Ireland and in other places, how you get marginalised and how your community gets painted into certain corners. I also know from being a journalist, and maybe mea culpa, having done it myself to others, that I'm really interested in going into those supposedly dark places and finding some of the light that happens to be there. So the Bronx really fascinated me. Also the sense of humor, the sense of resilience, and the sense of no matter what happens, we're still going to be around, was really, really, really interesting to me. And I met so many interesting people. And I feel privileged to have done so in many places around the world. But I think it's not the job of the writer to do this, but I think part of my job to find some of what Terry Tempest Williams would call the beauty in the broken places. I like the idea that we can go in, but I also went into Park Avenue as well, like in the same book with Claire. She's in Park Avenue, and that's a place that gets stereotyped as well, right? And the rich woman on Park Avenue, and I tried to scuff that up a little bit, because the truth is so much more nuanced than a lot of the time what we're willing to say. And that's where I think you guys come in. You can tell these stories over and over and over again. But yeah, the South Bronx in '74, what a place. Thank you.
So clearly, like throughout like your old spin, like there's a theme of how like trauma, like can bring people from completely different worlds together. And it sounds like narrative horror is like trying to do the same thing. And I was wondering if there was like an event or a person that like really kind of dug deep with you that created that meaning in these books.
I mean, this is part of the same question. If I could identify it, I don't know. I mean, there was plenty. I can tell you about loads of times when I had certain traumas, and some of them came after the creation of Narrative 4. I got beaten up in New Haven when I got involved, and spent a long time in hospital after that. When I was in Abilene, Texas, somebody tried to convert me in a church, and I was brought up as a very public spectacle onto a stage and all that sort. I've never even written about that. But I'm not so sure that I could find a specific moment where I sort of understood that, except the fact that when I went around the country on this bicycle and I met people, they would always tell me their most intimate stories. Like I'd come up, I'd arrive on my bike, sleeping bag, pannier bags, tent, and they'd say, where are you going to? And I'd go cross country. And they'd ask me about 5 or 6 questions, but then it became immediately obvious to me that they wanted to talk about themselves. And one of the factors, and I'm just thinking about this now because that was probably consistent, is that sometimes they would tell me some of the most traumatic things that had happened in their lives. I don't know what it was about me, but I think part of it was they knew I was leaving the next day. And that they were giving me the story, and that vicariously I was taking it down inside me, and they were spreading their story out in another place. And they maybe weren't able to tell that story within their community. That could be it. I mean, that would be... See, the Society of Skeptics got me thinking. These are great questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Emily. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I actually have 2 questions, if that's okay. So my first one was, have you faced criticism for the usage of racial slurs in your novel, and how would you defend or explain the implementation of such words?
See, this is great. I haven't faced criticism. I mean, a little bit, stuff online where people start to say, they repeat lines that your characters have said. And I am very careful about the use of pejorative terms. It's a difficult one. It's a really difficult, and I wish I could give you a stock standard answer, but my use of certain terms is certainly in Let the Great World Spin in 1974, all had to do with recorded conversations that I listened to, films that I watched, listening to urban histories and storytelling, and trying to reflect a deep sort of truth about what was being said at that particular time. Would I use those words now? That's a different question for me. I know you didn't ask that question, but it would be a good question now. If I were to write that book at this particular point, would I be able to use the same language? And I'm not sure. I wish I could give you the full answer. But I do think at the time it was entirely honest, and I would defend it and stand by it. And I'm very aware that of the power of language to denigrate, but also the power of language to lift us up at the same time too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Sorry.
so I have a question about the stories of Kira and Laura. In my opinion, I feel like those two characters are most likely, to me, the most ignorant and impactful characters of the story. But towards the end, it seems that they have like really happy endings. So I'm confused as to why like some more redeemable characters didn't get that kind of ending.
Yeah, that's life, right? I mean, you know, Kieran is not necessarily likable. You know, he says some very pejorative things, even about his brother. Lara is not necessarily likable. They end up together at the end of the novel, although have they split up by the time the whole thing finishes? They're married, but is there suggestion? Oh, well, I don't know.
They're a really happy couple.
What is it Tolstoy said about happy families? Somebody help me out here? Happy families are all alike, and unhappy families are something or other. Again, I can't. I find it hard to answer the question, except to say that sometimes that stuff happens, and sometimes people get a second chance. And I don't think characters necessarily need to live on moralistic lines, and because they got it wrong in the beginning doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get it wrong in life. And it would be too predictable for me to have, you know, certain people have an unhappy ending because they were bad. And you know, I think you deal with your characters on an individual basis, and you become skeptical about what they do and say. And so I'd have to reread it again, but I do appreciate your question.
We probably have time for one more question.
Oh no, I want so much more because it's so much fun. Can we just do a couple more?
Yes,
Will you get kicked out? You've had your... Okay.
Who's your team?
Oh, here's my team. This is the easiest one ever. Somebody guessed it earlier on. My team is Stoke City.
Oh.
Yeah, this is... that should have been my last question.
That one doesn't count.
Everyone could have had a great laugh at the answer to that question.
When writing the book, or maybe while starting the book, did you ever consider any alternative endings?
When writing the book, did I ever consider any alternative endings? There were other characters who were in the book who I got rid of. There was a Muslim hot dog vendor who was involved and was there, you know, looking up at the towers coming down. I couldn't capture his voice. It never worked for me, and he might have been part of the fabric. But the ending, no. The ending came along where Gloria is the one who comes out and looks after the kids. Seemed entirely right, and I love the fact that Jasmine slips into bed beside Claire before Claire dies. And some people could call it sentimental. I don't think so. I think it's full of sentiment, and there's a difference between sentiment and sentimental. I think as writers we have to risk sentiment, and sometimes we even have to risk humiliation in order to get to the real sharp edge of where we happen to be. I wouldn't change it. That said, I have been working with a filmmaker there have been several debates with a filmmaker about whether or not Corrigan lives or dies. So in the next version, it could be that there'll be, and maybe you come on board and help me out and figure out how to do this. I'm sure there's some good filmmakers here, in fact, who can help me do all of this. And we said we had what, one more, two more?
Couple more, yeah, go ahead.
I don't know who's had. I don't know what to say. Oh, okay, from the gods.
Mr. McCann, I wanted to ask about sort of your writing process. So I heard in an interview that usually when you write in your 9th floor apartment, sort of between two very tight walls with messages from you and other people on them.
Right.
But right now you also said that you write outside your apartment. So I wanted to know if sort of your final product differs from when you write inside sort of your comfort zone or your apartment.
It's a brilliant question because, each story has to find a particular place. I don't write in that cupboard anymore.
Yeah.
Literally, I was in the closet. I was like sandwiched in, and then I messed up my hamstrings. I'd sit there for hours because I couldn't climb out, and they all got real tight. And my doctor was like, "What the hell are you doing to yourself?" But you're so right because a novel finds a place, and sometimes. With a Paragon, which is a scattered novel that goes all over the place, I was able to write it in several different places. With Let the Great World Spin, it was very focused. It was in that cupboard. And I think with my next novel, it also has to be very, very focused for a little while. And I'm probably going to go to a cabin in Maine.
Yes.
Where
I know the place.
and I'll hang out there and try to write something. So wish me luck. We had, please.
What inspired your interest in community, and how did you pursue that? So what inspired you to follow and write and go instead of community?
These are the best questions. You don't get these sort of questions really anywhere else. What? Okay. I don't know. I don't know what inspired me. I swear to God, I wish I could tell you. I wish I could locate a moment and it could all be very simple. It could be reduced down to some sort of sauce that says, I became this person because of this particular thing. I do think a lot of it had to do with my teachers in school, and they were really open. I do think that my engagement with like literature and songs and storytelling had a lot to do with my father. And I do think an awful lot of it had to do with those people I met on the road. But then I also have to attribute it to my wife and to my kids and to a whole collision of different things that come together. If I could pull it down to one moment, I don't know what it would be. I will also tell you this one thing that I realized very recently is I talk a whole ton about my father, right? And I very seldom talked about my mother, but I go back to see my mother. She's 94 years old. And I remember that during my school years, when I was your guys' age, my school was just across from my house. And I would go sit with my mother for about 45 minutes every single day. And I think something must have happened there. Literally, I'd sit with her and have lunch. And she'd cut the edges off the side of the sandwiches. And, I'd have sandwiches ready for me, a cup of tea. And I think being that close to a woman sort of helped me too, because I think women have much more deeply empathetic instincts, and I think I was helped somewhat with that.
Okay, this sounds like a quiz question, but whatever.
Okay.
So at the
Yes.
very end of the Great World Spin, there was like this new character, Jasmine, sort of added in this sense of hopefulness to the novel.
Right.
But at the same time, like I found this, I don't know if this was intentional or not, this form of symmetry between Jasmine moving up like the social ladder and kind of Tony's hope for the other Jasmine now first, which kind of diminishes the hopefulness of it because after all, Jasmine lost her mother first to kind of have a brand new start and stuff. I was just wondering what your intention was when you were trying to convey in terms of like classism and stuff. Like, is it possible at all to move across?
I think one of the things about America is, or certainly was, until recently that it was very possible to move much more fluidly than you would move, say, in Ireland, England, or in parts of Europe. I was conscious that Jaslyn, who is the son of Jaslyn, who is the daughter of Jaslyn, who is the daughter of Tilly, was sort of moving up the social ladder, if you will. But she's also doing works of good. She's working for a non-profit, and you know, I suppose the book has overtones of what Gramsci would say a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. And I like that construction, because the world is a dark place, but our desires for the world can be different. So I like the idea that we can actually become pes-optimists in a certain way. And I do believe that Jaslyn sort of enters that world as a sort of pes-optimist. And also I think, by the way, I think that optimists are much more, much stronger than cynics. And to be a really good optimist, you have to be a cynic in the first place. Take the cynic all the way down, agree with her all the way to the end, and then say, but so what? To be cynical is no great revelation. The real revelation is to be cynical, but use optimism and vault away from it. And that's part of my philosophy, and I think we're getting that.
I think that's the
Can I just say something? This was so much fun. What a school, and thank you for every single one of your questions. I think we could talk for much longer. I appreciate you engaging with the book, and yeah, I'll talk to you afterwards and maybe sign some.